Leeds, Leeds, Leeds. What is happening? Welcome to Working Hours, a show about a place called Leeds, a time called now, and an activity called work. Working Hours wants to record 1,000 loiners over the course of this, the most important decade in the history of the human species, and ask them about what they do all day and hear how they feel about it. My mission is to try to map out what my city, Leeds, a city that has declared a climate emergency, is doing during humanity's biggest emergency. On Working Hours, we hear how loiners have, are, and will be coping with our multiple crises: the global pandemic, Brexit, and of course, the ongoing and accelerating collapsing of capitalism, the state, and the climate through this decade. To do this, I need people like you, dear listener. Most of all, I need people who are in Leeds or who are from Leeds to come on this show and be my guests. So please join me and help me with this mission whenever and however you can. Critically, I will need people like you, dear listener, as financial backers. Please consider supporting or donating to this project. You can do so with a £1 monthly donation via either Patreon or Ko-fi, or you could donate any one-off amount to Working Hours via either Ko-fi or through the LibrePay button on the About page of Western Studios website. Thank you. My name is Simon, and this is all my fault.
What did you want to be when you grew up? It's a really good question. I haven't prepared an answer for this. I sort of think that I might have liked to have been something in one of the sports. So I can remember some memories when I was a child, probably around about, 8 or 9 years old, thinking, I wouldn't mind being a footballer. And then that quickly got surpassed with, football's a bit difficult, possibly cricket. And then when I got to my sort of teenage years and maybe I was thinking, sports might not actually be a viable route for me to go down. Still quite fancy golf, but I just don't think I'll make it onto the world tour. So I did not have a very well sort of planned out route of, I wanted to become a player in the legal profession. That sort of, I suppose in a way you might say that happened a little by accident, probably like some other people will say that their parents influenced their choice of career. I'm not blind to the fact that, of course, things do ultimately boil down to personal choice. And if I didn't want to be in this career, I could be in a different career. But I remember my father, who was a salesman in the computer software industry, which at that time was fairly certainly not as developed as it is now. I think I'm reading between the lines here. I think he must have met a few lawyers and thought, well, they all drive great cars. They've all got massive cars. Well, I reckon you should do that, son. And I obviously at school you get some degree of careers advice, and I sort of talked it through with a couple of my teachers who thought that I would be capable of doing it. And I think that's really what sort of started me off down that track.
So did you actually go straight into studying law then?
Yes, I did. Yes. I went to Sheffield University, straight into a law degree, although I will mention that it also included a foreign language. I was always interested in foreign languages, and so I did go and study law. I suppose one of the benefits of having a language with it is A, it interests me, B, it of course afforded you a year abroad back in those days. I'm not entirely sure how it works now. I should imagine it's similar, but a year abroad was definitely something I wanted to do.
So what was the language?
French.
You're still listening to Series 3, and this is episode 46, and my guest, Stephen Griffiths. This is another Zoom interview recorded on the 8th of August, 2022. Hello, loves. Stephen Griffiths started his legal career in the private sector, but has worked as part of a legal team within a HE institute in Leeds for the past few years. He works on items like contracts, patents, or any other legal agreements that might be needed by the institution. There's obviously a lot more to both the role and Stephen than just that, but he didn't really give me much for his bio, so this is what we have. Perhaps it's genius marketing on his part. We'll see. Yes, We've had lawyers on before, but every interview is unique, so listen to this one anyway. Give me money on Patreon so I can keep making more of these faster and make them better. Patreon.com/working hours pod. Right then, let's get on with it then. Episode 76 of Working Hours with Stephen Griffiths. We may as well go on to the next question, which is what do you do now? I mean, we kind of touched on it anyway, but so what is it that you're doing now?
So I work in the legal team, as I said, at one of the higher education institutions based in Leeds. What that actually translates to in terms of day-to-day working life, I'm principally involved in looking at negotiating, drafting, amending various contracts. So they could be contracts for all sorts of different things, but in the main, the meat of my work is drafting agreements which relate to intellectual property that's created or controlled by the institution. So again, to simplify yet further, the simplest example might be something like a license to a particular piece of intellectual property. Could be software, could be a patent, could be all sorts of different things. And quite often it's a combination of a number of things. I also have some input into some of the matters which are decided at a fairly high level within the institution. So rather than drafting a specific license of a specific piece of IP to, a particular licensee, it could be a matter which is a sort of a more central concern to the institution. So that might be some sort of, perhaps the institution wants to develop a relationship with a particular outfit. It could be a commercial outfit, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a funding, a provider of funding in some way. Those are the type of things where I tend to get involved. I think it's always somewhat fraught with danger when you say you work in the legal profession. People will almost automatically assume that you're definitely a solicitor or you're definitely a barrister, and you almost certainly go to court every day, whether that's sort of suing the pants off people or sorting out divorce matters or sacking employees or something like that. That those tend to be, in my experience, the sort of things that come to people's mind, which isn't always true. It's certainly not in my case. I can definitely say that I'm very happy not going to court each day. I think if I was coming home each day thinking, well, that was a cracking day of arguing, I'm really looking forward to tomorrow's argument, then I think I would have gone quite a way off the path I choose. I think I'd like to look at my role as collaborative. So I'm constantly working with third parties, and although occasionally there's a temptation to bring some sort of adversarial element into the discussion, the truth of the matter is that both parties tend to win or win better, if I can say that, if it's a collaborative effort. There are compromises to be made, obviously, on all sides, and if we can get a compromise that works for us, then that is the job done.
Silly questions first. So what about the golf course and the country club? Are you a member of the country club, and do you play much golf?
Well, I used to play a fair bit of golf. I was a member at one of the clubs in one of the golf clubs in North Leeds. But I haven't been a member for probably something like about 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. I do still enjoy golf a lot. I mean, I'm even one of those people who's prepared to watch it on television, which is becoming rarer and rarer. But I've got I have a slight niggle in my right shoulder, meaning that I haven't actually been onto the golf course, truth be told, probably for about 18 months or so. I mean, I definitely hope to get back there. It strikes me that as much as people malign golf with it being a waste of a walk, or, I forget exactly the phrase, but
nice walk spoiled.
That's the one, yes. So I actually quite enjoy walking around the golf course, and particularly if you hit a decent shot, it gives you that sort of satisfactory feeling that is quite difficult to. I suppose it's a bit like hitting a cricket shot out of the middle of the bat or something, or maybe, catching your squash ball just right. So it's quite difficult to replicate the satisfaction that you can get when you hit a good shot.
Mm.
Yeah, so I am not currently a member of a golf club, but I have been in the past.
Okay. My next question would kind of be, how did you get into it? I mean, again, we've kind of covered some of that. How did you end up there, basically? I mean, was it sort of law degree and then you were like, this is the area I'm interested in, or was it just kind of the jobs you found sort of led you in this area?
Okay. I think part of a legal education sort of package, if you start at degree level, which I did, you have to cover certain basic topics. So, everyone needs to learn about, suing people. Everyone needs to learn land law and contract law and that sort of thing. So I'm very much today in the I do contract law sort of area. That being said, when I finished my law degree, I had what was then called a training contract. You then do, in my case, it was 2 years of training. So that's on the job training. I did it at one of the major commercial law firms based in Leeds. The firms generally will move you around into different areas to give you some exposure to either things that, might be new to you or stuff that you already knew that you might be interested in. So I worked in 4 different areas in the law firm. Certainly one of them I really didn't enjoy. At least 2 of the others I did quite enjoy. That started to give me an indication of where I fancied sort of ending up. And generally speaking, the way that law firms used to work, I should imagine it might be the same today, but you never know. You would maybe, I don't know, sort of 4 months before you were due to qualify, you'd be having those discussions about A, do you want me to stay? And B, where is there a vacancy? What sort of team can I fit into? And then you'd start thinking, obviously, do I know that team? Do I know the people there? So I had selected my area of practice, that was the corporate department. And what that translates to in layman's terms is it's the team that deal with business transactions, a lot of which are either one company buying another, or should we say one party buying another or another business. Or it could be the other way around. You could be acting for perhaps the shareholders of the company who want to sell their company and they've got somebody interested. Because of the firm that I started with, some of the transactions were a little more high profile. So that could be, I'm sure you're aware that, companies can list their shares on public markets, that you could go and buy some shares in, BT or whoever. And it also covered, so there was a decent international element to the work that I started doing there, because I think primarily because of the size of the firm and the coverage that they had. So I said it was based in Leeds, but in truth, this is a firm that had offices both around the UK and also internationally. So I started doing that, and I practiced in that area for probably about, let's say the thick end of 10 years, because it was in that sort of region. And then I sort of transitioned into the current, my current employer. My role actually within the institution I work has actually evolved over time as well. So it didn't always used to cover all the things that I currently do, but. And I think this is an important point I'd like to make, that in my opinion, I don't think you can get anywhere in the legal profession without having a decent grasp of contract law in particular. I certainly remember some of my professors at university indicating that essentially society itself is virtually based on contract law. I agree with you that we won't kill each other's wives or children, because if we do, there's a consequence. And that's an extremely abstract example, but it does in my view, proves the point that there are social norms, which if you want to be part of society, you have to agree to abide by that, which is very similar to entering into a contract saying that you will or won't do, X, Y, or Z.
What's interesting, what holds the interest for you? Like, obviously, you've been doing it over 10 years. Like, what makes you get up and go in? Is it like, a good legal clause, or is it just sort of the process and I would imagine it's kind of methodical of like, you get one contract, you work through the contract and you could work through the clauses and agreements and stuff and then get it settled and signed off. Like, what are the things that keep you going?
You've alluded to some of the aspects which are interesting. So I would say that given my career has had essentially two quite different chapters, one in the cutthroat commercial world for about 10 years, and then working at the institution, which, as I said earlier, is a bit more collaborative and a bit less cutthroat. There are still actually quite common goals between, or certainly common feelings between both roles. So to give you some examples of this, in what is now the first half of my career, the thing that actually drives you on, aside from, well, hopefully getting paid for what you're doing, the truth of the matter is that you might have a big transaction that you need to do. This essentially is, I think back to one of the transactions I did, which involved a family selling a business. The family had owned and controlled this business for several generations. Obviously, their goal was to sell the business, hopefully keep all of their workforce still employed, perhaps sort of dabble around the edges maybe for the next couple of years, and then essentially retire, clean break, and they could then go and do something else with their lives. Maybe that would have been investing in something else, I don't know, buying another smaller business. You could think of all sorts of examples. So the responsibility that's placed upon someone like me might be, you definitely want to not, well, you're trying not to knacker this family's plans because it becomes very obvious if you have done so. So there is a sort of a people element to it. You need to know your client well to know what their goals are. Sometimes you'd be surprised at what look like crazy decisions. Yes, I'll, concede this point, or I'm really, really keen on winning this particular point. You don't know which of those are actually terribly important until your client tells you which ones are really important. So there's definitely a sort of a people side to it. But I still fall back to my main contention, which is that actually completing the transaction is the worthwhile thing in itself. I'm ignoring all the things like, you'd obviously be sending them a bill for the, the costs and that sort of thing. It's a bit like, I guess it was a bit like completing a project at school. You would do a project and you might work on that for, a month or a couple of months or something like that. Perhaps you do the presentation at the end of it to the class. I guess in the context I'm talking about, it's well, here we are at the completion meeting. It's now time to sign all of the documents. You have the last minute little queries about what about this, that, and the other. But ultimately, certainly where the work I did was the rules were you're not leaving until it all gets done. The motivation is you've got a project and you want to see that project through, and you want to leave it in a position where it's all done and dusted, the ink's been put on the page, and people know what they're doing. And, I always think it's quite important. I say this to a lot of my colleagues. It's quite important that a third party might be somebody who, replaces me in 5 years' time, or if I go off and do something else, one of my colleagues might have to look at the document that I created. And if you've done a good job, then they can pick up that document, read it and say, okay, yeah, I pretty much understand what's going on. It's fairly clear. Nobody's perfect. You'll always find a couple of little clauses where people say, actually, does it mean this or does it mean that? But I would always hope that a third party could pick up the documents I've done, read it, and have a fairly decent understanding of what it was we were trying to do.
I'll start off with COVID. So I want you to kind of think back to before we went into lockdown and thinking about when you did lockdown, if you did indeed lockdown, and sort of when that happened, whether you were working more, working less, whether it was like a big increase in work or you were just like, whether it was kind of, you didn't know what was going on, and sort of what do you think have been the things that have changed for you kind of long-term work-wise because of COVID?
Okay, it's a wide subject area, so let's try and pick off various bits as we go along. let's just jump straight in with what happened when COVID hit. And the answer was, of course, we all got sent home. We were given computers and said, right, you're working at home for the next month. And of course, we thought it might last for maybe 3 weeks to a month. And here we are, some more or less about 2.5 years later. And I'm still sat at home with my laptop. It'll need replacing shortly, I'm sure, because it will be out of date. But we very quickly got to grips, probably like most people, with this thing called Teams or Zoom, or, choose your software application and insert there. But we had, I would say a fair amount of, let's call it, it's face-to-face over the internet time, isn't it, really? It's not face-to-face time. But I would say I had a decent amount of exposure to that. In terms of my workload, I would not say that my workload massively increased. What I would say, I suppose to finish that off, it didn't massively decrease either.
Yeah.
It was fairly even keel, but one thing which I'm absolutely certain of is that it is genuinely much more efficient for me to do the work remotely, or at least the bulk of the work. So if I cast my mind back to the times when I was going into an office 5 days a week, 9 till 5:30, I would, there are just so many distractions in an office. Every time you think, well, I might go and make myself a drink, and quite often you're either earwigging someone else's discussion, or you go and have a chat with, one of your colleagues. That, I suppose, I actually miss a bit. The interactions with your colleagues is something that I have realized that I've missed. That being said, when I was stuck into a project and we had to, the idea was we'd get it done by deadline, whatever it is, end of the month or something. There were so many distractions that working from home was a real blessing for me, because it meant that I could essentially churn through my work without the sort of interruptions. The only interruptions really were sort of seeing how many Amazon vans were going up and down the street and who was getting what. That's about it. I would say on balance, I could work more efficiently in a remote role. We do. So my employer certainly encourages people to go into the physical office if that's something you need to do, or even if you don't need to, you're perfectly welcome to take your computer in, go and sit at a desk, and as long as you're following all the rules and protocols, they're very happy to have you there. But my role, so again, going back to when I used to go into the office, I clearly need to communicate regularly and in some volume with my colleagues, who are the ones who are giving me the instructions, on document X, Y, or Z. But that's very, very achievable over the internet. In some ways, it's clearer. But I would say overall, I think that for probably 80% of my time, it's more efficient for me to be remote. In actual fact, I was doing a project that was so large pre-COVID that I'd even said to my boss, I just need to spend some time at home. And whether he liked it or not, I was contactable, but I was staying away because it was so involved. It was sort of a project that took me about 9 months to do, and getting peace and quiet at home actually made it achievable. If I'd been in the office for the entire time that I was doing that project, I think we'd still be there today.
Have you always been in open plan offices then while you've been doing this work? Or have you had your own office at any point?
So certainly whilst working with my current employer, it's always been open plan. I've been in different rooms. It's ranged from, so I remember when I first started, I was based in a different location to where I currently am. And I think I was in a room with, I think it was about 6 people. And we sort of had a director in an office next door. There's been a couple of interim moves, but where I am currently based, at least in my office, there's probably about 50 desks. So prior to COVID, there would be 50 people sat there. But these days when I go in, it tends to be on an organized, the team is coming in this day sort of basis. So I'd probably see maybe 20, 25 people, something like that. So probably half of the desks are empty, which, for the sake of complying with the sort of COVID protocols about keeping space and, all that kind of stuff, probably works fairly well.
You'll have to cram the time sometimes of okay, well, we need to do this. It's going to take this many hours. I am not going to do that in, like 9 to 5 work time. How does it work time wise for you? Do you feel quite squeezed for time, or are you normally quite good? Are you a bit of a workaholic, so you don't even think about it, or do you get quite a nice work life balance from it?
I think my view is that right now I have quite a nice work-life balance. It hardly needs mentioning, but I don't have to spend, 2 hours a day getting a bus or riding a bike into work. So I've already won 2 hours a day, which I can, use on whatever I choose. I think that certainly during, let's say since the pandemic affected workplaces, I have been quite able, without too much difficulty, setting limits on, right, well, I'll start at 9, but at 5:30, that's it, tools get downed. Of course, there are the odd exception, there always will be. But I guess you might say, oh, well, it's only one day and it needs doing, and you do it, and it's gone. The next day, the same pressure will not be there. I think it can be, you can fall into a little bit of a trap. If you are at home and you've got your computer at home and your computer is on, some people undoubtedly will be minded to, check what their email account is saying at 7 p.m. Yeah, I don't have that problem. I mean, I can, if the computer is still on at 7 o'clock, then I can probably see that sort of stuff, but I'm certainly not going to do anything about it until the next day, because, after work is my time. Put it this way, I don't have to fill out a timesheet, and therefore nobody is knocking on my door saying, hang on a second, why aren't you working, 7 p.m. or whatever, because you haven't done enough hours this month. Quite the opposite. I've got one of those roles where actually I think the bottom line is, provided that I get done what needs to be done, most of my colleagues, I think, will be happy with that as the result. If you're days or weeks late with the job, you're going to start to understand that that's not what they're looking for. But that's very much a rarity in my work. Maybe that's because I've got a good system organized. I don't know. Possibly there are others who do get into trouble that way. But I think that when somebody introduces me to a task that needs doing, one of the things I'm always going to ask them is, what sort of time frame are you working on? And if they say, I need it by the end of the week, then, I can look at what my other commitments are and organize myself accordingly. And if they say, I need it by the end of today, and I say that is, well, I'll either say it's just unrealistic, polite way of saying, no, that won't be happening. I mean, my overall impression, and I am grateful for this, is that I get a decent amount of freedom to organize my diary in a way that, that suits best. Probably worth touching on the fact that sometimes, probably occasionally is the better word, because it's fairly rare these days. I might be talking to somebody in the US, for instance, and of course they, us having something between 5 and 8 hours difference obviously means that our working days are, don't align. So if you wanted to talk to somebody at 9 o'clock in the morning, their time, that'll be anything from probably 2 in the afternoon to 5 in the afternoon here. And if it's an hour and a half call you're going to have with them, then that's one of those days when you might run over. You'd organize yourself such that, well, maybe you'll start half an hour later the next day, or, something along those lines.
I imagine you go into a day with your day's kind of planned in your head already before it's not like, oh, I've turned up at the office, what's happening today? It's like, what you're doing the next day, or, potentially through the week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is true. Yes. So I have my trusty notebook, which I just basically write notes on whatever anyone, gives me in terms of jobs. Your calendar obviously gets filled up with various bits and bobs. A lot of my calendar entries are not meetings with people, but I just block out the time to do, job number 1, job number 2, etc. And so I tend to, particularly when it's something I know I need to put quite a lot of concentration into, I might block off an afternoon or something, block off an entire morning, and I'm just not. Even if somebody calls, I would not answer the call unless I knew that it was, say, for example, connected with that particular job.
Yeah.
That's you see, allowing yourself to be interrupted like that, that gets you back into the field of having the problems that I used to have when I was in the office. You know, my boss is saying, we've got to get this document out today. And well, the next thing you know, you got, 2 or 3 people going, could I just ask you about this? And inevitably, when, what's the biggest lie in the workplace? This will only take 5 minutes.
Is that your line?
That's the line that people went, it's only a quick one. No, it isn't.
I'm going to move on to Brexit. Basically, the question is straightforward. Since we have Brexited, have you noticed any change in your work?
Good question. I've noticed changes, but I don't think I have seen huge changes as far as my working life is concerned. I still liaise with a lot of folk that live around the institution who are from an EU background. Still plenty of French, Italian, Spanish, etc., who are still colleagues. One of my sort of previous strings in my bow used to be that I helped a lot with the putting in place documents that were European funded and therefore probably involved something like, anywhere between about 5 and 10 European institutions, mostly universities, but not always. I mean, I don't do that anymore because I have a slightly different, angle with my role now. I mean, I don't know whether I haven't actually asked colleagues who look after that, whether that has changed for them. I thought when Brexit happened that, that'll be it. That department's going to close down because we're no longer in the EU. That has proven to be false. It hasn't.
They got more work.
Well, I'm not sure if they've got more, but what I would say is that, I thought it would be literally, there'd be, Downing tools and, they'd all get fired and nothing to do. But in actual fact, I think a lot of you had, let's call them, split it into 2 categories. You had EU funded projects that were already in place pre-Brexit and that therefore continued post-Brexit. Well, I mean, there's just no point kicking out your, English counterparts purely because of Brexit. And then, of course, new projects where, I don't know whether it's more difficult. I can't imagine it's less difficult for us to get funding. So I have to assume that it's either just as difficult or perhaps more difficult now. But I certainly haven't heard, in any anecdotal sense that there's not much to do on that front. So in my personal work, I don't think it's really had any change. That could be to do with the kind of folk that I'm, going up against, so to speak. But I thought some of my colleagues would have been harder hit than they have been.
Do you have to do any social media work in your role? And how much time does that take up for you? And is it beneficial to you? Now, I can't really imagine that you'll have to do much for your role, but I could be wrong.
No, you are correct in assuming that I basically do no social media at all in my current role. There are colleagues, of course, who are heavily involved in that, and some of them exclusively do that sort of thing. My employer's got many different Twitter accounts, that sort of thing. But it's not my job to get involved in those, and I don't really feel like I can contribute to them. Those sort of activities tend to have a quite particular agenda. Sometimes it's, raising profile of a particular thing that the institution's doing, but it's just not part of what I currently do. So I think the simple answer is, no real input into it. I have no objection to my colleagues doing what they do. Luckily, it's not force fed to us. We don't have to subscribe to the Twitter account. And some of them I do subscribe to because I'm genuinely interested in what they're talking about. But the vast majority I don't subscribe to, and nobody's ever objected to the fact that I'm not involved in them. And I'm happy with that as a sort of an outcome or a situation. I don't want to have to follow things that I'm not going to read. So it suits me the way things are at the moment.
I think you've raised an interesting point there as well. That like you follow some of the accounts. Do you find that you find out stuff there that you don't necessarily find out through sort of internal work channels sometimes, that you're just like, oh, that's happening, that you wouldn't necessarily have known? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that you do find out about things that you would not otherwise have found out about. But again, I think it's a reasonably innocent explanation, which is that the kind of things that I follow, which might be, let's say, a theme, like a research theme into, I don't know, environmental climate change or use of water or
mm,
energy or something along those lines. No person has got any business telling me what that department is doing in my workplace, because I never act for, a theme or a department. I'm always acting for, Professor X
mm,
or, academic Y or something like that. So it's very unlikely that any of them would want to involve me in their research team, other than, well, yeah, we need a contract now. Who's the guy that does that?
mm, yeah, yeah. And sort of internal things. We've touched on Teams and Zoom and so on. I mean, do you get benefit from the kind of chat, the internal work chat and those kind of things? Do you feel that that's kind of more fluid than email? Is there, I mean, is there a place for both? Is it different tools for different jobs?
Yeah, I think that. So that's it. We talked about COVID and differences in the working style and what have you, working practices in a previous question. But one of the things that I definitely remarked over the last 2.5 years is that where there is a change to, let's say, either a policy or at least a working practice that some of my colleagues have, that is not always explained to everybody who has a need to know.
Mm,
Uh, so somebody might say to me, right, I need you to do, a license agreement, and it's with these people, and we're going to license, their piece of software or something. Then I might
mm,
prepare that document, and the person might come back to me and say, well, why'd you put that in there? We don't do that anymore. And I say, don't we? Nobody told me that we didn't do that. Of course, I can learn that lesson from that moment onwards. But I think if I was spending 80% or more of my time in the office, the chances are I would get wind of that before, before somebody came back and said, this isn't quite right.
mm,
And I think that is, I've definitely remarked. So on a number of occasions, a couple of people have said, we're not using that method anymore. I guess it's, you could all, it might be useful to have some sort of monthly, update what's changing within our team, or, or which affects the work that we're doing, which we don't have. Maybe other teams do, but certainly my team doesn't. And because we have, probably like most people, some, either a weekly or a monthly team meeting. I think ours are every 2 weeks, but there are things that happen during that 2-week period, which you just, given all the other stuff you already need to do, deal with all the formalities and that sort of stuff. I just don't think there's enough time to actually say, well, by the way, we're talking to this person, we're thinking about changing our line on this particular point. Does anyone have anything to say? Or maybe it will just be the boss saying, this is how it's going to be. But the truth is that there just isn't enough time to pack it all in.
People talk about with media and communication, you sort of, well, we've got all these methods to communicate with each other, and like it's harder than ever. I think it's that we underestimate how hard it is to communicate. Like part of the reason, I think, rather than, they've just appeared, it's like we've invented all these new methods because we haven't cracked one yet where we can totally just like, I know exactly what you mean. And, and that's kind of why you're there as well. So it's like, look, we're all on the same page, like literally on this page.
Well, I think one of the other things that's it's all very well, trying to communicate in 1,000 different ways and, putting a load of content on your social media outlets. And, the answer was there had you chosen to read it. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, for every social media post you put out there, I need to take time to read it if you're expecting me to learn anything from it. So, and I think that a lot of the things that I was just talking about, in the sense of, we've had a change of stance on a particular issue. That's the kind of thing which you would get that learning by osmosis if you were in an office for 80% of your time. And I'm acutely aware of the limitations of working at home in that respect, because overhearing somebody talking about it in the corridor or something like that, that at least tips you off that it might be happening when you're physically in the office. Whereas if you're completely remotely working, well, that's just never going to come up. Nobody's going to accidentally sort of tell you something without having a meeting booked in the calendar.
It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. There's still a level of that with offices, because I know from people that worked part-time, or they worked, like even people that are just part-time, it's like, because you're not in the office all the time, you would miss stuff. And like people wouldn't think to kind of update you if this has happened or that has happened. In your role, would you like to do anything to raise awareness or to help with adaptation or mitigation of climate change?
Okay, it's another wide-ranging question. So,
Yes.
my employer is very active in, let's call it the sphere of everything to do with environment, climate change, that sort of thing. And I strongly support what they're doing. I think it's a very responsible stance to take. Do I want to do things in my job? Well, the truth of the matter is I already do things in my job which have certainly have one eye on not solely climate change, but I'm going to say the word sustainability. We're aware of the limits to the resources which are available not only to us but to everyone else who lives on the planet as well. So of course things like recycling and getting to sort of carbon neutral and net zero and all that sort of thing. There's an awful lot of initiatives already in place which address those things. Given that I work at an institution with a great number of serious and high-ranking academics who concentrate on this subject, I genuinely don't think I can actually help them a great deal. I think it's the other way around. But I'm perfectly happy to, follow either sort of policies or guidance or whatever you might call it, regarding how we should be behaving in that regard. You might imagine that a couple of years ago, my job would be a lot more paper heavy than some other jobs. If you're just somebody who's on the phone for 8 hours a day, you're probably not going to use a great deal of paper. Whereas if you're drafting documents and then checking them and then amending them, that is, that's a role which cries out, you're going to use a lot of paper. And whilst we've been doing our best to recycle the vast majority of the paper for quite a while now, the last time I printed a document, I think possibly earlier this year, but only on a couple of occasions. So, I'm already aware of the fact that I was just not using that resource in the same way that I was previously, which makes me feel fine about it. There are some challenges not having a physical paper document in front of you, but with the technological tools we've got available to us, it's not so difficult to surmount those sort of problems. I do feel like I participate in that area by following, I hesitate before saying the rules, but you might as well say the rules that are imposed upon us. But I don't object at all to having rules along those lines imposed. I'm somebody who's, I am concerned about, the environment and climate change generally. So I'm kind of all ears to that sort of thing.
It's not an abstract issue now, is it? Because when you've got a third of Pakistan underwater, you've had temperatures temperatures hitting 50 degrees around the world all through summer, and in some cases people's winters. It's not something that's abstract enough in the future anymore.
No, far from it. It's thrust in our faces on a daily basis, but I would probably say rightly.
I'm thinking that with an institution such as yours, and you've got, it's kind of values based stuff, but all of that's policy for you, you've got to, it's not a legal statute. Well, maybe it has connections to, depending on their arrangements and so on, but the organization is like, these are part of our values. So I would imagine that's got to be part of every kind of contract that you're kind of working on?
There is an element of that in the contractual world that I live in. I mean, I certainly wouldn't. I would be lying if I told you that every contract I did had a schedule.
Yes.
You're not allowed to use, excess resources or something like that. But we do have. So, I mean, if you said, well, if somebody came to me and said, right, like I need a contract and it's going to be with this particular company, it's a company that's involved in one of those industries that's very exploitative of the resources it's using, then I think that I would be referring the question of should I be doing this job? I'd be referring that upwards to get a view on, do we want to engage with, say, a coal mining company?
Yeah.
Or, I mean, you could put a number of different industries into that pot, but there are certainly, as a question of fact, there are some industries which the institution will not want to be involved in. And that pot of, who don't we work with, that evolves over time. I think, generally speaking, the institution's intention is to work with as many people as it can. That's a sort of a start point. But I do think that there are always caveats to, do we really want to work with, company X that's been exploiting child labor in, sub-Saharan Africa for the last 20 years. And there's a big expose in the press about it. Whilst I use that example, another example just as good would be some sort of environmental impact that this other organization has had. We're not going to work with everybody.
Yeah. And reputations, like, it's a big thing in that area because you need so many people to be accountable to.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's reputation is not absolutely the first thing that is considered when we think about do we want to do a job, but it's definitely on the list and it's definitely top half of the list. Higher education institutions need to raise funding, and they need to get it from public money, and they need to get it from industrial source. I suppose I could call it private finance. And we, as more and more companies, of course, are jumping on the boat of hang on, we don't want to be associated with you if you're doing X. Well, we need to make sure that we need to make efforts to ensure that we're not cutting off a source of funding by virtue of the fact that we are involved with, let's say a controversial party. I mean, we are currently talking about somebody controversial from an environmental perspective, but it need not always be from that perspective. It could be, it could be for another reason, but certainly the environmental and sustainability considerations are to the fore quite often.
Yeah. If you had a universal basic income, so you've got your basic needs met, how do you think that would change your work or your attitude to work? Would you still be doing what you're doing now? If you would still be doing that, would you be doing it the same way? How do you think it would change things for you?
Well, it's difficult to know where to start with that. So I assume, let me just make sure that I'm along the right lines first. By this universal basic income, you're suggesting that every person, man, woman, child, or other, is getting, I don't know, £10,000 a year or something.
Yeah, but that's an amount to live, yeah.
Yeah, a number. I mean, my first reaction is, I don't know. It's a tough question. So I suppose maybe I could try and address some of the issues that you would like me to talk about. I guess by starting with, do I agree with it? And I don't know whether I agree with it or not. It's another good question. I think it probably would have, it would influence my job insofar as it would change things somewhat. I mean, we currently live in a society where certainly the majority are encouraged to go out and, do work, earn money, thereby better yourself, make sure you've got the resources to support you and your family and all the rest of it. If on the other hand, that was just given to you on a plate, we probably tell something by my phrasing there. I'm not sure that I fully agree with everybody getting a number because, I mean, presumably the system that that concerns would be everyone gets a number. And then if you want to do a job or something extra on top of that, you've got the ability to earn more, cash or resources or whatever it might be. Yeah, I don't know. The bit that I'm wrestling with a little is I quite like the incentivization that drawing a salary gives people. If you're hell bent on becoming a millionaire, well, you're probably going to spend 18 hours a day, trying to develop that idea, which will turn you into a seven-figure wonder. If everybody was getting a number and it was enough to survive on, I think probably you would find that attitudes among society were such that there are perhaps less people who do want to go out there and, fight the fight and sort of better themselves. I think it would reduce the incentive to do that. And I'm not sure that's something that I would necessarily applaud.
Is that a bad thing, though, in a situation where most work is kind of driven by creating carbon, and the thing that we need to stop is carbon? I mean, don't you think there is a benefit to putting lots of people out of work? Because we have this kind of obsession with growth and production. So I like to use the David Graeber thing of like, you make a cup once, you wash it 100,000 times. Like, shouldn't some people be doing less? And, some people are kind of a bit unemployable.
You've given a different perspective on the question there, which I hadn't immediately considered. And I can see some sense in saying that, but I think ultimately, or probably, I think probably I'm going to fall back to a position of saying it's very well to say, let's give everybody, X amount of pounds that they can spend. But where does it come from?
Where does it come from?
What if everybody said, do you know what? This year we're all happy to have, like this notion of £10,000 and we're all just going to stay at home. I mean, where does that money come from the following year? Because I would argue that the economy is done a lot less. Perhaps today it is fundable, but I think if many more, if you saw a massive shift in the demographic of people who are actually doing a job for earnings, and by that I mean, to the extent that most people actually decide that, I could just sit at home and, get my standard sort of bread and milk each month and I won't actually do any work. I think that is the system then sustainable? Where do you find that cash from in year 2? What about in year 3 when even more people are deciding? I mean, from an environmental perspective, it probably would help the planet if we all just sat down and did nothing for a couple of months or something. Well, we did that a couple of years ago, didn't we? I mean, I remember, so I say that slightly in jest, but I certainly remember probably, what was it, maybe after 2 months of lockdown, wow, everything was so peaceful. And I genuinely think I could hear more birds and other wildlife, and you didn't have that constant stream of cars going past the end of the road.
Or planes.
I mean, there was all sorts of things which, I don't know, the whole world seemed a bit more greener at that moment.
And a bit less stressful, apart from not being less stressful, because obviously it was really stressful with the pandemic.
It's so I would say for me, that was less stressful, definitely. But I'm not immune to the fact that, one must recognize that large numbers of people were having super stressful times because their job had gone. And what were they going to do about it? There wasn't anywhere to go out and get a job. Everywhere was closed. So,
Or they were doing like twice as many hours for just the same amount,
Yes. So I think that, it certainly seemed a real breath of, you'll have to excuse the pun, but a real breath of fresh air to not hear the constant stream of traffic and to hear the birds sing.
Okay, so I'm going to do one more rephrase on this. Basically, it's a way of me asking, so I've said this a couple of times now, but it's a way of me asking the question, if money didn't matter, if it was no object, would you still do the job? Like, would you still turn up? Or would
Yeah.
you do less hours, or would you be like, oh, I'll do it occasionally, or I'll go into business for myself and I'll be an exclusive brand? Like how do you think how do you think it'd change things for you if you didn't have to consider money?
Yeah. Okay, it's a decent rephrase. Well, what would that change for me? Would I just sit back and do no work at all? No, I don't think I would. I think that's a really dangerous road for some people, but I would put myself in that category. If you said, look, I'll pay you and you could do nothing, do you want to do nothing? I'd definitely have a serious think about saying, yeah, I'll do nothing.
I think most people would.
Yeah, I don't think I realize for myself that it's far better for me to occupy my mind and I guess, my hands with something. I don't want to, I think it can be quite a slippery slope if somebody takes away that. Yeah, I think it refers a little back to the incentivization I was talking about previously. I'd want to keep myself occupied and busy. I might choose to do, maybe I'll choose to reward myself a 3-day weekend or something. But I think a 5-day weekend, a 6-day weekend, a 7-day weekend, that's just not going to work for me personally. Some people perhaps, but for me, yeah, I think that's really dangerous. I think it's just such a slippery slope before you just put your feet up and you don't do anything. And I just don't think I can do that. I don't think I would be comfortable with doing so little. And I suppose, I could quite easily say, well, I'd be happy doing, I don't know, 4 days work a week. And then on the other, 3 days, maybe I have a day or two of rest a week. And that final missing day, yeah, maybe I do try and, develop some sort of side hustle that I can build into something that will reward me. It could just be a hobby, I guess. But yeah, I think, yes, even if I got paid for doing nothing, I do not think I would do nothing.
You can change any 3 things at work. What would they be?
Well, that is a good question. So what would I change? I would probably like to change within the institution the dynamic that currently has some foothold. And this dynamic is one where decisions are made by committee and often many committees. I think that we could do with, so I say the institution I work for, but I do think this is a point of wider application. I think a lot of higher education institutions could do with this sort of change. I do, the work I do is reasonably fast moving. It's absolutely standard for one of my colleagues or my superiors to say, I need this done by the end of tomorrow, and I'll do it. Unless that's unrealistic. But I think with other jobs around the institution, it's quite often that you might say, could you do X for me? And then you end up having to remind them in 2 weeks' time because it hasn't been done. You ask them why not. They say, oh, well, I had to refer it upwards. And then that went upwards again, so it can be quite frustrating having a lack of decision. It's almost like suffering from collective indecision. How do we answer a question? Well, I guess it's a Twitter poll across, 10,000. Let's ask the whole world what we should do. Luckily for me, that doesn't impact me so often. I think there are probably other colleagues of mine who do get caught in that trap more often. But for me, I'd like a little stronger direction and decision making sometimes. That's one, and I'm out of ideas already. What else? I honestly think that there's so many good things that I could say about where I work. That I'll kick myself, and for thinking that nothing should be changed. But I mean, in terms of burning changes, I can't. I don't have a list of 10 people.
Yeah, the commute's gone, hasn't it? So you get to work from home. You've got some peace and quiet. You could still go into the office.
Yep,
you're doing kind of what you enjoy in the area that you're enjoying it. It's not
actually. I do. I tell you one thing that I wouldn't mind seeing changed, and that is access to the various facilities which we have. On a either free or subsidized basis and I don't know whether this is just for the staff there or for everybody, even members of the public. But I think about I mean, most places either have a gym or have access to a gym, and other various sort of physical recreational activities.
Mm.
I think if they said, if the institution said, well, actually, you can go there for free, they would inevitably have to sort of, let's call it, ration access in some way. But maybe it's as simple as, I don't know, your surname begins with B, and therefore you can go on the second day of each month or something. Maybe that would, of course, then I say between these hours. I mean, that's the sort of thing where, I think that could provide a tangible. It provides a tangible benefit, not only in the fact that you get access to the facilities for a reduced or no cost,
Mm.
but that feeds into the sort of well-being of the staff angle, which I think is really important. And I genuinely think my employer does look at the well-being of its staff as a serious issue, not to be overlooked.
Mm.
That is something they could do, which I think would help.
Mm.
Those are things which I can genuinely stand behind and say, yeah, I guess I thought about those to a greater or lesser extent, and I do think that a change there would be welcomed.
Mm. I'm going to throw it over to you now. So just if you've anything to say that we've not talked about, anything that you'd like to discuss, anything that you'd like to bring up, or anything that you want to promote, or even if you like if you do any volunteer work, anything like that you want to kind of like flag up, any social media you want people to follow, anything like that, over to you.
Perhaps one of the other things I could start to address is, I mean, we've talked quite long and large about, working from home and not going into the office so much. I think traveling for work purposes is something that, I could definitely spend a moment talking about. And the reason for saying that is it has now become such an alien concept, not having done it for, as a minimum 2.5 years. By this, I mean, traveling outside of where my institution is based here in Leeds.
Mm.
So maybe I would, travel to Birmingham for a day's meeting, travel down to London, or it could even be internationally. It now seems such an alien concept. I mean, I'm not sure would I do that again? And then part of me starts thinking, well, you need to feed into this topic of debate the fact that it seems that around the world, quite a lot of folk have said, actually, why do we need to get this chap over from England? We're going to have to buy his plane ticket, which will cost €1,000, put him up in a hotel, feed him. Why don't we just open the computer like we normally do and participate in that way? It certainly opens your eyes to the fact that, I mean, certainly winding the clock back many years when, I'd quite often have to, for instance, get the train down to London and it'd be an all-day meeting, and you'd be getting on the 7 o'clock train, you'd be coming home on the 8 p.m. train, it'd be a very long day, all the rest of it. But of course, first things first, you take 5 hours worth of traveling off that day if you were just doing things remotely, which then starts to make you think about the environmental lack of impact that using a computer to do your meetings in that way. The tangible benefit is that people don't need to use the ridiculously expensive train. So there you go. There is resources being spent by either my employer or the person that's inviting us down. It just sort of, it almost rams home the point that we used to do things in some instances, you would say, a really inefficient way. Inefficiency can be viewed from different perspectives, but in terms of use of resources, it seems like it was very inefficient. I mean, I'm certainly not all of the problems are solved now, but I do think that some of the problems are solved. So when I travel into the office, which I probably do once every couple of weeks or so, I ride my bike every single time I go, even if it's raining, because it's actually really nice just to get out there. I mean, I'm a bike rider.
You're not doing it every day, are you? So it's not like, oh God, again.
Well, exactly. Yes. I mean, it can sometimes feel like a game of roulette cycling through ahead of me, particularly during the rush hour times. But I mean, I'd happily ride there in the rain for the sake of the fact that you're getting out. And, I guess there's a lot of good things about that. One of which is that you feel like you're participating in the agenda about, when we talked about the environment and climate change, and I mentioned sustainability, all of those sort of things, those are big ticks in the box by sort of doing that. And I think that in previous times, although I used to ride my bike a bit into work, yeah, it just wasn't the same as now. I mean, now if you said to me, can you drive to your office? I think I'd pretty much object on principle and say no, but I'd happily get my bike to go there. I don't miss the, actually there's one other thing which that makes me think of. I was talking to a friend about this, probably a year ago, I would say, and it's the use of face masks. So I was going to refer to the fact that I used to get on the bus each morning. The bus would be absolutely packed by the time we were 3 or 4 stops down the road. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm sure you won't have missed the fact that literally thousands and probably hundreds of thousands of people just in Leeds get ill towards the end of September, start of October. Mm-hmm. And of course, generally speaking, we'll say, well, it's all the students have come back, and there's sort of three massive universities in Leeds, and there's hundreds of thousands of people descending upon the city. And quite often I found myself on the bus, you can hear somebody with a hacking cough sat behind you, and you thought, you know what, I really just want to hold my mouth and nose here. Well, of course, with the advent of the pandemic and the widespread use of face masks, as I said to my pal last year, it's legitimized the use of those. So it's no great revelation that a lot of students from places like China and Korea and that sort of thing attend universities in Leeds. And I don't know what it is, but those guys are perfectly happy wearing face masks literally every year.
SARS. It was SARS.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but now I feel like I can do that. And I mean, you're right, you might look at me funny the first time, but the fact is probably half the people are going to be doing the same. I suppose that it was almost an inevitability that you'd get a nasty cold at certain times of the year. Whereas now, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm as we've said, I'm not traveling into the office that often, but I still see the days coming when I'm going to have to get on that bus, and there's going to be people, not very well on that bus.
Hacking, spluttering everywhere.
Yeah.
I was in London for a while, and like you were always getting ill from the buses and stuff, because it's just so many people. I love it when, you get one of these buses in winter and you've got all your winter coats on. So, you get in there and it's kind of freezing outside, but then everyone's hot because there's a temperature change of all these bodies in there. And then someone opens the window and then you've got cold blasting in your face. It's like, oh, this is horrible. But then I'm a big advocate as well for more mass transit and so on, because we need more public sort of transport. But then if we need to travel less, I was going to ask you about sort of localism, because it sounds a lot like, I mean, your sort of work miles will have fallen off the cliff by the sounds of it. So the amount of travel that you're doing compared to what you were doing. I mean, if you went decade by decade, like 2 years into the last decade, you probably have circled the earth a couple of times by now.
Yeah.
I mean, does that make you, has that kind of shrunk your world outside of work as well? Like, do you travel around less, or do you sort of travel as much or more? Like, do you think it's had any impact?
Yeah, another good one. I think, on balance, I'm probably going to say that it hasn't had a major effect in one direction or the other. So, I think most people would say their working week, they're based at home, I've got, home stroke office attendance, but then, you do something at the weekend, and that doesn't necessarily involve traveling to the other end of the country every weekend, but you definitely want, some visits or that kind of thing to places that you haven't been or haven't been to recently. And I'm still doing those, whether that's seeing friends or, driving up into the Dales to go for a hike or a bike ride or something like that. I'm still doing it. Visiting my family, for me, is a trip to the South Coast. So I'm still doing that, admittedly not every weekend. But I would say that the regularity is pretty much the same as it used to be. I mean, yes, I suppose I could say that there was a time, in the pandemic proper, so turning the clock back a couple of years ago, where I mean, I'd be looking with sad eyes out at my car, thinking, well, crikey, I'm going to have to go and do some miles in it, because otherwise the battery's going to go flat.
Yeah.
But I mean, that has become less of a problem. Certainly as I've got used to the fact that I work at home. I suppose, I guess I would say that I've got some level of agreement with you when it comes to, did it shrink your world? I mean, I barely go into the office these days. So seeing the four walls of my, it used to be a makeshift office. Now it actually feels like my office. That's, yes, that takes a bit of getting used to, but it almost makes you feel more incentivized to say, right, so weekend, I'm going to go to the seaside or the Dales, or I'm going to go into town to go to the cinema because it's something different from watching the telly.
But then that's probably still a reduction in miles, because you've already got rid of those miles of travel. So I mean, it'll be
5 days a week. I mean, there are weeks where it differs, but the vast majority of my time, 80 or 90% of the time, I'm not doing the, round trip of about 12 miles or something to go to work. So the mileage in that respect is drastically reduced. And I'm not doing more mileage at the weekends that is, enough to sort of make up for the reduction, if you know what I mean. But I don't mind that at all. I mean, in my mind, it just means I have less impact on the environment, which is negative. I mean, even if one advocates, as you called it, mass public transport, to save, stop having 50,000 cars driving into town. Instead, just put 1,000 buses on, or 1,000 trains, or 1,000 trams.
Tube. Let's have bloody tube.
Well, I mean, I'm a lot of transport
or trams or a monorail or something, but we should have, like, Leeds is big enough. We should have something.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you really think so? I mean, I was at university in Sheffield when they built the tram there, and I think I probably used it maybe 3 times in 4 years or something. Well, I mean, that's perhaps a bit disingenuous, because they hadn't actually completed it until I came back the following year. But the fact remains, in the remaining, 9 months I was there, I used it 3 times or something. I think the problem with the reason I'm not a massive proponent of having a tube, a tram, something like that in Leeds is because I'm acutely aware of the fact that, so the buses have, in my opinion, pretty decent coverage. For me personally, I only need to walk about 100 yards to the bus stop. Some people are less fortunate. They might have to walk 300, 400 yards. Some people will inevitably have to walk half a mile. But with a static, fixed system like a tube or I mean, you can't just go, I'll tell you what, this year we're going to have a train line that goes straight up to Dossall Road. That sort of thing takes 10 years to build.
Oh, yeah.
You can't chop a chain. Whereas a bus route, you can say, actually, can you start turning left at the top of the road, not straight on, because we need to go around the back of the houses and pick up some more people. And I think the size of I probably don't need to tell you how much a tram, tube, etc., those systems are outrageously expensive. I honestly struggle when you see numbers quoted in the press about, it's got to be a 400 billion pounds to build 3 miles of train track. I just think I can't see how they're going to spend that money without making the track out of money. And then they're going to have to make the foundations out of gold as well. I just don't see how it's so expensive. I mean,
isn't it? It's people in the way. It's contracts.
Well, I mean,
getting paid, and people like having to do bits of work and do bits of research, and
I mean, it's in my field of view, because of course it's public funding in the main that funds it, and the numbers they talk about are just outrageous compared to, well, various other things. You'll probably be aware of that promise that was made during Brexit times, which I probably don't need to repeat. Here's a hint: it has a connection with buses, and that sort of number is absolutely small fry compared to some of the numbers that you might hear about things like HS2, for instance. I don't know how much it is per mile, but it's a massive. It's probably a bigger number than the number that I was thinking about per mile. So if you want to make 150 miles worth of track, I mean, it's just an outrageous amount of money. I'm sure it's greater than the GDP of a lot of countries, no doubt. It just seems quite wasteful, or maybe wasteful isn't the right word. Maybe just expensive is the right word. Near to where I live, they've just opened let me get this right, I think it's the East Leeds Orbital Road. So it's basically a nice new stretch of road. In my mind, what have they done? They've built some extra roads, feels like they've maybe done about 5 miles worth of roads. I'm fairly certain that the cost of it was either $1 billion or, it must be many hundreds of millions of pounds. Well, and of course, with the economic conditions being what they are at the moment, maybe in a couple of months, we'll be looking back, wondering, saying, did we need 5 miles of extra road, however smooth it might be? Or would we have been better, say, I don't know, giving people free heating or something for a month? Don't know the answer, but, I just feel with a lot of the public projects, the numbers involved are outrageously large.
Thank you again to Stephen for being my guest. Thanks again to all my guests, and thanks to you, Leeds, for being my subject. And of course, most of all, thank you to you, my dear listener. See, a nice short one with not too much editorialising in it. Did you like that? Was that better or worse? I don't know. But if you want to tell me either way, you can. Super easy like. You can follow this show on Twitter at Working Hours 3 and on Instagram at Working Hours Pod Leeds. Use the hashtag Working Hours Pod Leeds to stay up to date on when new episodes are being released, to DM me with your questions, or most importantly, to get in touch if you'd like to be my guest on this show. Please do chuck in anything you can to help the show grow. Go to ko-fi.com/working hours and join me there for £1 a month, or you can make a one-off donation of whatever amount. You can also go to patreon.com/working hours pod to support Working Hours, again from as little as £1 a month. Why not be super awesome and join both? Do something new and something different. Remember to like, share, follow and subscribe to Working Hours. That's me. Cheers ears. Take care out there and be kind to each other, Leeds. Working Hours is produced, recorded, edited and published by Simon Treen for Western Studios Leeds Limited. The music was The Bees from Chopin's Etudes, which is in the public domain and was taken from museopen.org. Please like Western Studios Leeds on Facebook at facebook.com/Western_Studios_Leeds and on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/company/Western-Studios. Leeds, are you considering taking the plunge into podcasts or audio content? Then think Western Studios for support, advice and guidance on getting it made. At Western Studios, you work with a real-life learner who is actually in Leeds. Not a piece of software, not a course of articles or a series of live chats and video courses, but me, a person in physical place-based reality. If you want to work with me to make your podcast or any digital audio content in Leeds, whether it's for your own cause, your publicity campaigns, to promote your products, increase your sales, or just to create your own passion projects, then get in touch with me, Western Studios, now. Don't wade through vapid articles and videos and podcasts about how to make podcasts by disembodied virtual people on the web. Get on with making your podcast now, and then when it gets hard and expensive and it all goes wrong, which it will, then call Western Studios to make your podcast with you or even for you. Western Studios will take on your podcast's boring, time-consuming and painful admin, recording, editing, transcription, whatever. Tell me about your podcasting pain points and I can make it all better for you. I feel your pain. For a charge, I will share it. Remember, podcast work is work. Leeds businesses, Leeds campaigns, Leeds brands. Got an inkling that you'd like a podcast but don't know where to start? Contact Western Studios at makemypodcast@western-studios.com and we'll start making your podcast straight away. The first hour of arranged consultation and pre-production time is free. £25 an hour after that for editing, recording, production. I can also arrange hefty discounts for the right projects. So tell me your idea and your budget and I'll tell you what I can do for you. What do you have to lose? Time. That's what. Time is running out. The best time to make a podcast was 10 years ago. The second best time is right now. Writers in Yorkshire, what are you doing with your lives? Hopefully you're writing. Well, I know there are listeners out there who want to hear great original writing performed as audio content that is about and for and has been made in Leeds. How do I know this? Because I'm one of them loiners what wants it. Help me make your old screenplays, unpublished novels, unperformed plays, stories, poems, and performances, whatever you got, baby, and make it as podcast content. Is your work arty, salacious, pulpy, strange? Good. Is it unfinished? Good. I can help you with that too. I can work with you to find actors, musicians, and voiceover artists and quickly realize your projects. I get practice making the shows and you get a finished, performed, and published version of your writing. Save yourself the hassle and the headache of making your podcasts on your own by working with me instead.